Most of us think we already know what the universe is. I did too for a long time. We imagine space filled with matter, governed by laws, unfolding mechanically from the past into the future. And if God exists at all, he is usually imagined as something outside this system, watching it, intervening occasionally, but fundamentally separate from it. That picture feels obvious, it feels neutral, almost like common sense. But it isn't. It's a very specific way of imagining reality, and it's surprisingly recent. The modern mind tends to assume that the universe is a closed system, that everything that happens can, in principle, be explained by interactions between physical parts. Meaning, consciousness, and value are then added on later as byproducts. What surprised me is how often even religious people quietly adopt this picture. God becomes something like an external engineer, the universe becomes a finished product, and meaning becomes something we project onto an otherwise indifferent world. The philosopher Charles Taylor describes this shift as one of the defining features of modernity. He argues that we now live within what he calls an imminent frame, a way of seeing reality as self-contained, sealed off from anything beyond it. Within this frame, even belief in God changes. God is no longer the context in which reality exists. He becomes one object among others, just much bigger, more powerful, and harder to see. And once I noticed that shift, a question wouldn't leave me alone. Why do we assume that reality itself must be something external to God in the first place? That assumption doesn't come from science. Science describes patterns within reality. It doesn't tell us what reality ultimately is. And it doesn't come from early Christian theology either. It comes from a gradual change in how we learn to imagine matter, mind, and causality. Alfred North Whitehead called this mistake the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's what happens when we treat abstract descriptions, particles, forces, equations, as if they were the ultimate substance of reality itself. In other words, we mistake the map for the territory. We describe reality mathematically, and then, almost without noticing, we begin to assume that reality is mathematics made solid. Once that assumption is in place, everything else follows. Mind becomes secondary, meaning becomes subjective, and God, if he exists, must now exist outside the system, because the system has already been defined as complete without him. But notice what's happened here. A metaphysical decision has been smuggled in under the appearance of neutrality. We didn't discover that the universe is separate from God. We assumed it. And once that assumption settles in, other possibilities stop feeling thinkable. For example, what if reality isn't a thing that exists on its own and then happens to be observed by minds? What if reality is closer to an expression than an object? What if the universe is not best understood as a machine, but as something more like a thought? Structured, ordered, intelligible, but not independent of the mind in which it appears. At this point, I've noticed an immediate resistance within many people. That resistance isn't scientific, it's philosophical. It comes from a modern habit of treating matter as primary and mind as accidental. But that habit isn't timeless, and it isn't inevitable. So before we ask what Christianity or any religion actually claims about reality, we have to pause here. Because the biggest obstacle isn't belief or disbelief. It's the assumption that reality must exist outside of God in order to be real at all. And once you look closely at that assumption, it turns out to be far less obvious than it first appears. If I step outside the modern picture for a moment, a very different way of understanding reality starts to come into view. In early Christian thought, creation isn't described as God assembling pieces of matter the way a builder assembles bricks. It's described as something stranger than that. Creation happens through word. That detail is easy to miss because it sounds poetic, but philosophically it's doing a lot of work. A word isn't a physical object, a word is an expression of meaning. It comes from mind, not from matter. So, when early Christian thinkers spoke about the world being created through the Word of God, they weren't imagining divine construction work. They were describing reality as something that emerges from intelligence, and that idea didn't appear in a vacuum. Jewish and early Christian philosophers were already working with the concept of the logos, a principle of divine reason, order, and intelligibility. One of the most important figures here is Philo of Alexandria. Philo argued that the logos functions as the rational structure of reality itself, the pattern through which the world becomes knowable. For him, the physical world doesn't stand on its own. It is shaped, ordered, and sustained by meaning. Early Christian thinkers took this and pushed it further. For them, the logos isn't just a principle God uses. The logos is divine, which means reality isn't merely designed by intelligence, it is grounded in intelligence. Origen went so far as to argue that created things exist first as ideas within the divine intellect before they exist in any physical sense. In that view, the world isn't a collection of independent objects that later become meaningful. Meaning comes first. Physical existence follows. Centuries later, this line of thought reaches one of its most refined expressions in Maximus the Confessor. Maximus taught that every created thing exists according to its own logos, its own divine idea. Not metaphorically, but literally. A tree is not just matter arranged in a certain way, it is a specific expression of divine meaning. And you are not merely a biological organism, you are a particular articulation of intelligence. So reality in this framework is not built from the bottom up, it unfolds from the top down, from meaning into form. This already puts us very far from the modern picture. In the modern view, matter is primary and meaning is secondary. In this older view, meaning is primary and matter is how meaning becomes visible. And once you see that shift, another assumption starts to wobble. If creation is an expression of divine reason, then creation isn't something that exists alongside God as an independent thing. It exists by participating in God. Participation is the key word here. To participate doesn't mean to be identical, but it also doesn't mean to be separate. A thought participates in a mind. A melody participates in the musician. It has its own structure, but it doesn't exist independently. Early Christian theology consistently uses this kind of language. Things are real, but their reality is borrowed. They exist, but not from themselves. This is why creation was never understood as something that could simply run on its own, like a machine that has been switched on and left alone. Its existence is continuous dependence. Not dependence in the sense of constant interference, but dependence in the sense that meaning cannot detach itself from the mind that gives rise to it. At this point, a subtle distinction matters. You can say the world was created by God. Most people are comfortable with that. But early Christian thinkers were also willing to say something stronger. The world exists in God, not as an object floating inside a container, but as meaning existing within intelligence. Once that idea is on the table, the modern image of God standing outside the universe starts to look odd, because words don't exist outside the speaker, thoughts don't exist outside the thinker. And if reality is grounded in word rather than raw matter, then separation becomes much harder to justify. And with this, I don't mean God and the world are identical. That conclusion would be premature. But it does mean the universe isn't an independent object that merely happens to have a creator. It is an expression, and expressions don't float free from the source that expresses them. So before we even talk about omnipresence or intelligence or consciousness, we've already crossed an important threshold. Reality is no longer something that exists first and is interpreted later. Reality itself is already interpretation, already meaning, already shaped by mind. And once that's granted, the question of separation stops being only a theological problem. It becomes a conceptual one. Once I started thinking of reality as an expression of meaning rather than a detached object, one familiar idea stopped behaving the way I expected it to. That idea is omnipresence. We usually say that God is everywhere, but the moment you slow down and listen to that phrase, a problem appears. Everywhere normally means spread out across locations in space. It suggests distribution, extension, like air filling a room. But classical theology was never talking about God that way. God is not present the way air is present, or radiation, or gravity. The claim is much stronger than that. Thomas Aquinas argued that God is present to all things, not as one being among others, but as the very act of being itself. In other words, God is not in things the way water is in a sponge. Things are in God simply because they exist at all. That distinction is easy to miss, but once you see it, it changes almost everything. If God were just another entity inside the universe, even the largest one imaginable, then separation would make sense. God would occupy one region of reality and the world would occupy another. But that isn't the classical view. God is not located. God does not take up space. God is not one thing alongside other things. God is the condition for anything existing in the first place. Paul Tillich captured this with his phrase, the ground of being. God is not a being. God is what makes being possible. Once you actually take that seriously, the idea of a universe that exists outside of God starts to fall apart. Because outside only makes sense if God is something that could be contained, bordered, or excluded. But being itself has no outside. This is usually the point where people feel uncomfortable. I can feel as if God is getting too close, too involved, almost dissolved into the world. But notice what's really happening. Nothing has been added to God. Nothing has been taken away. What's changed is the picture of where reality stands in relation to God. The modern imagination tends to place God and the universe side by side, like two separate objects on the same shelf. Classical theology doesn't do that. It places the universe within God. It places the universe within God in the same way thoughts exist within a mind. That doesn't mean the thoughts are identical to the mind, and it doesn't mean the mind is exhausted by its thoughts. But it does mean the thoughts don't exist independently. This is why the idea of God creating the universe and then stepping back, leaving it to run on its own, never sat comfortably within classical Christian metaphysics. If existence itself is participation in being, then there is no moment when creation becomes ontologically independent. Existence isn't something that can be handed over and forgotten. It is continuously received. And that reframes what divine presence actually means. God is not present because he occasionally intervenes. God is present because nothing could exist for even a moment without that presence. Once you see that, the usual way of thinking about miracles, prayer, and divine action starts to look distorted. Intervention assumes absence, but presence removes the need for interruption. If God is already the ground in which reality unfolds, then divine action doesn't compete with natural processes, it underlies them. That's why early theology didn't see laws of nature as barriers to God, they were expressions of order, and this leads to a quiet but decisive consequence. If God is omnipresent in this way, not as a thing within the universe, but as the ground in which the universe exists, then the sharp boundary between God and creation begins to blur. Not collapse, not disappear, but blur. Because separation now has to be explained rather than assumed. Up to this point, I've stayed mostly within philosophy and theology, but there's a place where I didn't expect these questions to start resurfacing: modern science itself. Not as religious claims, not as proofs of God, but as quiet shifts in how reality is being described. For a long time, the dominant scientific picture of the universe was mechanical. Reality was matter in motion, governed by fixed laws, unfolding predictably from the past into the future. In that picture, mind shows up late, a strange byproduct of sufficiently complex matter. But over the last century, that picture has started to strain. Not because science has become mystical, but because matter has stopped behaving like the solid foundation it was once assumed to be. At the most fundamental level, physics no longer talks about reality in terms of solid objects. It talks about fields, probabilities, relationships, information. One of the figures who helped crystallize the shift was John Archibald Wheeler, who summarized his view with the phrase, it from bit. He wasn't claiming that reality is literally made of computer code. What he was pointing to is something subtler. Physical things seems to arise from informational distinctions. What exists is not just matter, but meaningful difference. A similar concern appears in the work of Paul Davies, who has repeatedly asked why the universe is not only governed by laws, but is intelligible at all. The question isn't just why the universe exists, it's why it's comprehensible. Why should abstract mathematics, products of mind, describe the physical world with such precision? There's no clean materialist answer to that. Mathematics doesn't push particles around. Equations don't cause events, and yet the universe behaves as though it's written in a language that mind can read. At the same time, cosmology has started revealing structures on the largest scales that don't look mechanical at all. Galaxies don't distribute themselves randomly, they form vast interconnected filaments, a cosmic web stretching across billions of light years. The overall pattern is strikingly network like. That doesn't mean the universe is literally a brain, but it does suggest something important. Reality seems to be organized relationally, not mechanically. What matters aren't isolated objects, but how things are connected. Even time has become less straightforward. In quantum physics, events don't always fall into a clean, linear sequence. Observation and measurement play an unavoidable role in how phenomena appear. This has led some physicists to describe reality as participatory rather than passive. Wheeler himself spoke of a participatory universe, where observers aren't external spectators but part of the structure that brings phenomena into definite form. That language would have sounded bizarre to classical mechanics, but it resonates strongly with much older metaphysical intuitions. Reality doesn't sit there complete and self contained, waiting to be noticed, it unfolds through interaction. None of this proves that the universe exists in the mind of God. Science can't answer metaphysical questions of that kind, but it does something just as important. It removes an objection. The universe no longer looks like a machine made of inert parts. It looks more like a system grounded in information, relation, and intelligibility. And those are exactly the features you would expect if reality were closer to expressions than to construction, closer to thought than to artifact. At this point, a convergence starts to come into focus. Classical theology speaks of reality existing by participation in divine reason. Philosophy of mind struggles to explain consciousness in purely material terms. These disciplines aren't doing the same work, they don't share methods, they don't reach identical conclusions, but they keep circling the same questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is that something intelligible? The idea that reality might exist within a deeper field of intelligence no longer sounds like an exotic religious claim. It starts to look like a coherent metaphysical possibility, one that modern categories have simply forgotten how to name. And once that possibility is taken seriously, the question stops being theoretical. It becomes personal. If this were true, what would it mean to live inside such a reality? If the universe isn't a detached machine, and if reality exists within a deeper field of intelligence, then human experience starts to look very different. At that point, perception is no longer just a survival mechanism, it becomes a form of access. We usually think of our senses as tools for navigating an external world. They help us avoid danger, find resources, and coordinate with others. That's true as far as it goes, but it's not the whole story. Our senses do something more basic than that. They disclose reality. Sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell aren't additions we place on top of the world. They're ways the world becomes present. And if reality exists within the mind of God, then perception isn't happening outside that mind, it's happening within it. You're not standing at a distance observing something foreign, you're participating in something that already contains you. This idea isn't abstract, it shows up very explicitly in Christian mysticism. Meister Eckhart repeatedly spoke about God knowing himself through the soul. For Eckhart, creation isn't merely something God did in the past, it's something God is expressing in the present. To exist at all is already to be involved in divine self disclosure. That doesn't mean individual persons dissolve into God. It means individuality itself has a deeper context. Your thoughts, your experiences, your awareness, they aren't sealed off from the source of being, they're movements within it. Another early Christian voice puts this in a strikingly simple way. Irenaeus famously said that the glory of God is the human being fully alive. That line is easy to quote and easy to miss, because notice what it implies. God's glory isn't increased by distance, or fear, or withdrawal from the world. It's revealed through aliveness, through awareness, through engagement with reality. If creation exists within God, then human consciousness isn't an accident, it's a capacity to encounter meaning directly, and that changes what it means to relate to God. Relationship no longer primarily means communication across a gap, it means participation within a shared reality. Prayer becomes less about persuasion and more about attention. Contemplation becomes less about escape and more about alignment. Even ordinary experience starts to look different. When you pick up a flower, you're not holding a meaningless object that you later interpret. You're encountering a specific expression of order, form, and coherence. You can explore that expression through your senses. You can see its structure, feel its texture, smell its fragrance, even taste it. Each sense reveals a different dimension of the same underlying reality. And if the world exists within the mind of God, then you're not merely using your senses, you're exploring from the inside. In that light, human beings start to resemble travelers. Not travelers moving through empty space, but travelers moving through intelligibility. Explorers of a reality that is already saturated with meaning. This also casts new light on an old theological phrase that often sounds vague: the idea that human beings are made in the image of God. If God is imagined primarily as a supreme object, that phrase becomes difficult to interpret. But if God is understood as the ground of intelligence and awareness, then the image becomes clearer. To bear the image of God is to be capable of knowing, of perceiving meaning, of participating consciously in reality. It isn't about resemblance in form, it's about resemblance in mode. At this point, a statement from spiritual traditions begin to make sense. Some say that you are entirely God, but that God is not entirely you. In other words, your being is fully dependent on the whole, but the whole is not limited to your perspective. You aren't the source, but you are a real point of access, a localized window into something infinite. If this is true, then life isn't a test staged inside a meaningless environment. It's an invitation to explore, to attend, to awaken to the depth that's already present in experience. And that brings us to the final set of questions. Not questions about doctrine, not questions about belief, but questions about how one would live if this picture of reality were true. At the beginning, we started with an assumption that reality is something external, something self contained, something that exists on its own, whether meaning is present or not. Over the course of this exploration, that assumption hasn't been refuted, it hasn't been replaced with certainty or with proof. It's simply been open. We followed an older way of thinking, one where reality isn't detached from its source but continuously held within it, where existence is participation, where meaning isn't added later but already present, and at this point there isn't really anything left to argue, only questions remain. If the universe exists within the mind of God, what does it actually mean to be alive? Not as a task to complete, not as a test to pass, but as a form of exploration. What if your senses were never meant only to help you survive, but to help you encounter? What if sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell are ways the depth of reality reveals itself from the inside? What if attention isn't passive, but participatory? What if prayer isn't about sending words across a distance, but about becoming aware of what you're already within? What would silence mean then? What would listening mean? If every moment unfolds within God rather than outside of Him, what does separation even mean? What does abandonment mean? What does distance mean? And if human beings are capable of knowing, of perceiving, of understanding, not accidentally, but because reality itself is intelligible, what does that say about who we are? Are we merely observers inside a meaningless system? Or are we participants in something that's already saturated with meaning? What if being made in the image of God isn't about resembling God in form, but in awareness? What if consciousness isn't a glitch in the system, but the point of access? And finally, if this were true, not proven, not enforced, but simply true, how would it change the way you look at the world, the way you look at others, the way you look at yourself? What would it mean to live as though you're not standing outside reality trying to make sense of it, but moving within it as a finite perspective inside an infinite mind? That question doesn't demand an answer, it simply asks for attention. And maybe that's where any genuine relationship with God actually begins.